Before we dive into this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It was one of those incredible summer nights where the warm breeze filters through the open window and everything is still and quiet. I had spent the entire day at my grandma's house helping her with the garden, fixing up a few things around the place, and just enjoying her company like I always did when I visited her place. It was like a second home to me, filled with memories of my childhood, of her taking care of me and the sense of comfort that only she could provide. By the time the sun had set, I was ready for bed, but I couldn't wait to see what the next day would bring. I was so tired I could collapse into the bed in the guest room, which she always kept made up for me. I remember drifting off to sleep quickly, the soft sounds of the night lulling me into a deep, dreamless slumber. But at some point during the night, something stirred me awake. I wasn't sure what it was at first. Maybe it was the feeling of the sheets shifting or the faintest sound of footsteps on the hardwood floor outside my room. I blinked my eyes open, groggy and excited. I was so cozy and relaxed, and the moonlight was streaming in through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room. For a moment, I thought I was imagining things, but then I heard it again. The soft creak of the door slowly opens. My heart was racing with excitement, but I wasn't afraid. It was just Grandma, probably checking in on me like she used to when I was a kid. I could just picture her in her nightgown, moving down the hall. Silently, she made her way through the house, ensuring I was tucked in, comfortable, and safe. It was a habit she'd never quite broken. Even now that I was much older, I decided to keep my eyes closed, pretending to still be asleep. I was curious about what she would do next. Maybe it was silly, but there was something oddly comforting about the thought of her still watching over me like that. I could hear the soft rustle of her clothes as she stepped into the room, her movements slow and deliberate. The air shifted slightly. As she came closer to the bed, I could sense her presence beside me, standing there quietly. My breathing slowed, trying to remain even though my heart was racing a bit now. A strange anticipation building within me. I didn't know why, but the idea of her being so close watching me while I slept stirred something inside me that I couldn't quite explain. Then I felt it, the gentle touch of her fingers on the blanket, pulling it up slightly as if she was. Her touch was soft and warm, almost reverent, as she made sure I was properly covered. My body tensed for a moment, but then relaxed, reassured by the familiarity of her hand on my skin. This time, though, there was something different. Something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Her hand lingered a little too long, and I could feel the weight of her gaze on me even though my eyes were closed. Even though my eyes were still closed, I was wide awake now, but I kept my breathing steady, pretending to remain in my dreamlike state. Her hand moved again, this time lightly brushing against my arm as though she was making sure I wasn't too cold. But the way her fingers trailed over my skin sent a shiver through me. It was a slow, deliberate touch, something far more intimate than I had ever experienced from her before. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of the situation, but my body was betraying me, reacting to her touch in ways I didn't fully understand. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. My body was reacting to her touch in ways I didn't fully understand as her fingers continued their slow exploration. I could hear her breathing, steady and quiet as if she was lost in thought or perhaps something more. The seconds stretched on, each one feeling heavier than the last, and I couldn't shake the strange mixture of emotions swirling inside me. Confusion, curiosity, and something else that I couldn't quite name it. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I was unsure of what to do or how to react. Part of me wanted to turn over to see her face and ask her what she was doing. But another part of me was too afraid to break the silence. I was too captivated by the unfolding moment to bring it to an end. She moved closer. Then the bed dipped slightly as she sat down beside me. I could feel the heat of her body through the blanket. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 1 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. The soft weight of her presence grounded me. In this incredible moment, her hand, now free of the blanket, found my arm again, and this time her fingers moved with more intention. Slowly tracing their way up to my shoulder, my breath hitched in my chest, and I struggled to maintain the pretense of sleep. My body responded to her touch in ways that I didn't fully understand, but I was excited to find out more. Her hand moved with a slow, practiced grace, and I realized that this was no accidental gesture. There was a purpose behind it, and I was eager to find out what it was. I felt the warmth of her palm pressed lightly against my chest, just above my heart. For a moment, I wondered if she could feel the erratic rhythm it had taken on. My skin tingled under her touch, and I could sense the weight of something unspoken hanging between us, filling the room with an almost palpable tension. She leaned in closer, her breath warm against my ear. I could hear the whisper of her movements as she settled beside me. I could hear her breathing, warm against my ear. Her hand, which had been resting on my chest, began to move lower, tracing slow circles across my skin. My mind was spinning, a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions that I couldn't control. What was she doing? Why wasn't I stopping her? Question raced through my head, but my body remained still, caught in the strange spell she had woven around us. Her touch grew bolder, and I could feel her hands sliding down. The length of my body lingering at the edge of the blanket before slipping beneath it was incredible. The sensation of her fingers on my skin was both startling and thrilling, and I bit my lip to keep from gasping out loud. Her movements were slow and deliberate, and with each passing second, the boundary between what was real and what I had once thought impossible seemed to blur. I wasn't sure how much time had passed, but it felt as though the world outside had disappeared, leaving only the two of us in this quiet, magical space. The charged space was electric with anticipation. Her hand continued its slow exploration, and I could feel her fingers tracing patterns on my skin. Each touch ignited a spark that sent ripples through my entire body. She shifted again, her weight pressing more firmly into the mattress as she leaned over me. Her breath, now warm against my neck, sent shivers down my spine. I could feel the faintest brush of her lips against my skin, so soft that I might have imagined it if not for the warmth that lingered afterward. The sensation sent a shiver down my spine, and for a moment I was lost in the pleasure of it all. The first time I let out a small, involuntary sound, a quiet gasp that broke the silence between us. Her hand paused for a moment as if she was waiting for a reaction. But when I didn't pull away, she continued her touch, growing more insistent by now. The air in the room was thick with tension, and I could feel the electricity crackling between us, charging every movement, every breath. I could sense that she was testing the boundaries, pushing the limits of what was possible, and I was caught in the current of it, unable or perhaps unwilling to resist her touch, grew more intimate, and I felt my body responding in ways that I hadn't expected. My pulse quickened, my breath became shallow and uneven, and I was filled with a sense of anticipation. Her hand moved lower still, and I could feel the weight of her presence pressing down on me. Her fingers traced a path that left me breathless. My thoughts were a jumble now, a chaotic mix of confusion, desire, and something else that I couldn't quite name. I wanted to say something to ask her what she was doing and why. She was doing this, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I lay there still pretending to be asleep, my body betraying me with every subtle shift, every barely concealed reaction. She was so close now that I could feel the heat, and I could sense the quiet determination in her movements. The way her hand continued its slow, deliberate journey across my skin, each touch felt like a question, and my silence seemed to be answering them one by one. I was excited to see what the answers meant. There was something hypnotic about the way she moved, and I found myself sinking deeper into the moment, letting the rhythm of her touch guide me. Time seemed to slow down, and I was lost in the sensation of the night. Our breaths were the only sound in the room, and her hand, which had been tentative at first, had grown bolder. I could feel the weight of her intent pressing down on me like a physical force. My mind was caught between the need to understand what was happening and the overwhelming desire to let it continue. And I was overcome with an incredible desire to let it continue. Then she started to remove my nightdress. She continued moving her fingers on my naked skin, touching everything she could touch. All of my body was exposed to her, and she kissed lightly on my skin, kisses trailing down to my legs and other parts of my body. I couldn't say anything or move, so I started enjoying it. After a few minutes of her kissing me and exploring my body, she withdrew her hand and slipped away from me. The absence of her touch was even more exciting than her presence. I was left feeling both relieved and strangely bereft. I could hear the soft rustle of her clothes as she stood up and the quiet creak of the floorboards as she moved away from the bed. I lay there, my heart still racing, unsure of what had just happened or what it meant. What it meant was something I couldn't grasp fully, not yet. My mind was a blur of emotions, torn between the familiarity of who she was and the strange new feelings she had just stirred within me. As I lay there still pretending to be asleep, I couldn't wait to see what would happen next. I couldn't help but replay every single second of her touch. Her fingers had traced my skin like she knew exactly what she was doing, and it left me aching with questions I couldn't ask and a hunger I didn't even know I had. The room was quiet again, but it felt different. The air itself had shifted, charged with a tension that wouldn't go away. My body still burned with the memory, and I was excited to see what would happen next. I was filled with a sense of her warmth, and I knew there was no going back to the way things were before I heard her footsteps grow faint as she moved back into the hallway. But I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still with me somehow, that her touch lingered in the surrounding air. The bed felt empty and cold without her presence beside me, and I found myself wanting her to return, turn, and finish whatever she'd started. It was as if she had started something. My pulse quickened at the thought, and I was filled with a desire to be close to her again. But what could I do? I was caught up in the confusion of it all, unsure if I should confront her or let it remain an unspoken secret between us. Something I would carry with me in the quiet of the night. Despite the confusion, I could feel the intensity of the moment. A part of me was growing inside me, wanting more, longing for her to come back and continue what she had begun. The weight of that desire pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. I knew that no matter how much I tried to push it aside, it was there to stay. My mind drifted back to the feeling of her fingers on my skin, the way she had hesitated just for a moment. Before she became bolder, she was more certain in her movements. It was like she had been waiting for this, and she wanted it as much as I did. That thought sent a shiver down my spine, and I could feel my body responding once again to the memory of her touch. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 2 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. I shifted under the blanket, the fabric clinging to my skin, and I felt exposed beneath her gaze. I couldn't stop thinking about the way she had leaned in, her breath warm against my neck, her lips barely brushing my skin. There had been something in the way she hesitated, as if testing the waters, waiting for a sign from me. And I hadn't stopped her. That realization hit me harder than I expected. I hadn't pulled away, hadn't pushed her hand off me, even when I knew I should have. Instead, I had let her continue, letting her touch me in ways that blurred the lines between right and wrong, between what was acceptable and what wasn't. The room felt too small, too charged with the intensity of what had just happened. My body was still on edge, alive with the memory of her fingers. I knew I wouldn't be able to fall back asleep. Quiet of the house was. I was filled with a rush of emotions, a feeling of being overwhelmed but also alive with possibility. My mind was buzzing with questions and desires, and I couldn't wait to find out what the future held for us. Despite the confusion, I was excited to see where this would lead. I wanted her to come back and take me deeper into the unknown. As I lay there, as I grappled with the swirling emotions inside me, I heard the faint sound of her footsteps again. My pulse quickened, and I was filled with a rush of excitement. My breath caught in my throat. I was filled with anticipation. What if she stepped back into the room? What if her touch found me again? Would I let it happen? Would I let her cross that boundary once more? Or would I stop her? The weight of the unspoken tension between us was unbearable, and the anticipation was almost too much to bear. Anticipation was already starting to bubble up inside me, but then the footsteps stopped and the silence stretched on, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the lingering traces of her touch in the quiet that followed. Reality started to sink in, but it was a good kind of reality. It was exciting. The intensity of the moment was still there, but it was being balanced out by the clarity of my thoughts. The fog of desire lifted just enough for me to realize the gravity of what had just happened. This was my grandma, someone who had cared for me my whole life, someone I trusted. But tonight something had shifted, something incredible that couldn't be undone. My heart was filled with the excitement of this new realization. I knew things could never go back to how they were before, even if nothing more happened. This moment would hang between us, a silent reminder of the line we had come so dangerously close to crossing. I didn't know what would come next or how I would face her in the morning, but I knew one thing for certain: tonight had changed everything. Whether I wanted to admit it or not, something deeper had been awakened inside me. A desire that wouldn't easily fade. As I lay there in the stillness of the night, I realized that the answers wouldn't come easily. I would have to live with the questions with the haunting memory of her touch and the unspoken bond that had now been forged between us. A bond that would linger long after the night had passed. Even as I tried to push those thoughts away, I couldn't escape the vivid memory of her touch. My skin still burned with the heat of her fingers and the way she'd moved. With such careful intention, the image of her standing over me, the slight brush of her lips against my neck, played on a loop in my mind twisting something deep inside me. There was no denying the pull I felt, that strange, undeniable craving for something I knew I shouldn't want. Clawed at me, making it impossible to think, but it was a good kind of crazy. My inner self was filled with an overwhelming desire for her to return and rekindle that connection. I was ready to cross the line and break free from the constraints of what was right. My pulse raced with excitement as I felt the intense pull of those unspoken desires. That moment, I realized the allure of the forbidden was like a siren's call, drawing me in with its seductive charm. Forbidden, it drew me in like a flame threatening to consume me whole. The more I fought it, the stronger the temptation became. I was trapped in a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't control. I knew that nothing could ever be the same between us, but I couldn't deny how much I wanted her to touch again. That same spark that had ignited earlier that night felt electric with possibilities. I felt a tension that pressed down on me like a weight, but it was a good kind of pressure. As much as I tried to quiet the need inside me, I knew it wasn't over. Not yet. This moment, this night had awakened something far more intense than I'd ever imagined. It was something that could no longer be contained.